if you fix a leaky faucet, right, your roof doesn't just cave in.
No, hopefully not.
Right, because the plumbing system is contained.
Yeah.
But if you try to fix California's housing crisis, you might, accidentally bankrupt a local school district.
Yeah, the domino effect is very real.
It's massive. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Tuesday, May 19, 2026. And today, we are looking at the 5 people applying to run, the world's 5th largest economy.
Which is not a small job.
No, not at all. And we're going to map out the underlying mechanics of how their, honestly, vastly different platforms would actually operate out there in the real world.
Because the stakes here, they extend way, way beyond the state borders.
Oh, absolutely.
The person who wins the 2026 California gubernatorial race, they're going to inherit an administrative apparatus that effectively dictates national market standards.
Right, because the sheer size of the market.
Exactly. When the California Air Resources Board changes an emissions regulation, auto manufacturers in Detroit, they don't just build a separate car for California.
All right, that would be too expensive.
Yeah, they change their entire North American assembly line. Or when California updates digital privacy laws, Silicon Valley rewrites the internet for the globe. So we are really discussing the prototype for American policy like a decade down the line.
Which is exactly why we are cutting through the standard campaign rhetoric today.
Yeah.
We've got a massive stack of election resources here on the table.
We really do. It's a lot.
It is. We've got the 2026 California Gubernatorial Race Candidate Comparison and Platforms Guide, primary election guides, fresh polling data, and this really cool interactive values alignment quiz.
That quiz is going to be super helpful later.
Definitely. And our goal today is to help you, the listener, whether you are a brand new voter stepping into this arena for the very first time or a seasoned political observer trying to cut through the noise. We want to help you make a wise, informed decision based entirely on your core values.
Right, because we don't endorse candidates here.
Never. We dissect them. Okay, let's unpack this. Our promise is impartiality. The goal isn't to tell you what to think, but to give you a clear, unbiased roadmap of how these 5 major candidates differ.
Regardless of your political leanings.
Exactly. So we're going to look at Xavier Becerra, Steve Hilton, Tom Steyer, Katie Porter, and Chad Bianco. And we'll see how they plan to approach the big ones: cost of living, housing, homelessness, and public safety.
But understanding those candidate platforms first requires understanding the, highly unusual machinery of the California primary itself.
It's a weird system.
It really is, because the math of this election behaves differently than almost anywhere else in the country. We operate on the top 2 primary system.
Right.
And the mathematical implications of that are often completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, I was looking at the historical voter turnout data, and the leverage that a single voter holds in this specific primary is just staggering.
It's huge.
So to visualize this for someone who might be new to the system, you really have to forget the traditional idea of, a Democratic primary and a Republican primary operating in completely separate silos.
Right. Throw that out the window.
Exactly. Picture a massive marathon instead.
Yeah.
Everyone lines up at the exact same starting line. Democrats, Republicans, independents, third-party candidates, everybody.
All in one big bucket.
Yeah. The starting gun fires, and only the 2 absolute fastest runners advance to the November general election. Even if, and this is the crazy part, even if they're wearing the exact same team jersey.
Right. You could have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans. And the architectural design of that system, which, by the way, was implemented by voters back in 2010, it was intended to moderate the legislature.
That was the theory, right?
Yeah, the theory was that if 2 Democrats are running against each other in the general election, they have to appeal to Republican and independent voters to actually win, thereby pulling the extremes toward the center.
But the data in our primary guides shows it doesn't always play out that cleanly in practice.
Not at all.
Because primary turnout is historically just abysmal compared to the general election.
It really is.
You might have 20 million registered voters in the state, but if only, say, 5 or 6 million actually cast a ballot in June, the math gets wild.
Very wild.
If the Democratic vote fractures among 3 really strong progressive candidates, and the Republican base consolidates behind 2 conservative candidates, you could mathematically see 2 Republicans advance in a state where Democrats outnumber them nearly 2-1. Or obviously vice versa.
Exactly. Which means the general election in November is frequently a mere formality.
Yeah.
The true fork in the road is happening right now in the primary. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the candidates who advance in this primary, dictate the ideological boundaries of the state for the next 4 years.
Right.
Small, highly mobilized coalitions dictate the future for 39 million people.
It's a lot of power.
It is.
So let's bring those candidates onto the field. I want to do a rapid but really thorough side-by-side comparison of the 5 candidates dominating the polls right now.
Good idea. Establish the mental map.
Yeah. And we're going to bypass the standard bullet point platform summaries and instead look at the cognitive frameworks these candidates operate within.
Because that's what actually drives their decisions.
Exactly. Because when you look at the top concern in every single poll, the astronomical cost of living in California, the solutions offered by these 5 candidates represent fundamentally different diagnoses of the disease.
Right.
Let's start with candidate number 1, Xavier Becerra. He's a Democrat and really the current establishment anchor.
Yeah, Becerra represents the belief in institutional leverage. I mean, as the former Attorney General of California and the former U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services under the Biden administration, his whole framework is inherently bureaucratic.
He knows the machine.
He knows the machine. He views the state's problems as operational inefficiencies rather than, structural failures.
So his solution to the housing crisis isn't to blow up the system, it's to grease the wheels.
Right.
Looking at his proposals, he wants to streamline the permitting process and utilize existing state funds to sort of incentivize local municipalities to build. He is essentially promising a highly competent administration of the machinery that already exists.
And the appeal there is stability.
Yeah.
For a significant portion of the electorate, particularly older homeowners or established business owners, the current system works reasonably well.
Sure.
But the negative externalities, like visible homelessness, have just gotten completely out of hand. Becerra offers a course correction. However, the vulnerability of the institutionalist approach is that you end up owning the institution's failure.
Right. You can't claim you're an outsider.
Exactly. His opponents frame his vast experience as complicity in the very crises Californians are currently experiencing. They say he's just the status quo candidate.
And there are also specific vulnerabilities outlined in the opposition research within our sources. I mean, when you run a massive federal agency like HHS, you absorb the political fallout of everything under its umbrella.
Oh, absolutely.
He has faced intense scrutiny over the oversight of migrant child welfare during his tenure. Critics argue the agency basically lost track of thousands of unaccompanied minors.
Yeah, that's been a major talking point.
And there's also an indirect connection to a past staffer fraud scandal back in California. Even if he wasn't personally implicated, the bureaucratic buck stops with him.
That is the double-edged sword of executive experience. You have a record of execution, sure, but you also have a sprawling record for opponents to mine.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that institutionalist approach with candidate 2, Steve Hilton.
Right, running as a Republican.
Yes, running on a platform of aggressive systemic disruption. Hilton's cognitive framework is that the institution itself is the poison.
Now, Hilton's a fascinating entry because he's leaning hard into the outsider label. Yeah, he's a former Fox News host and was a chief strategist for UK Prime Minister David Cameron. His diagnosis for California's cost of living is entirely regulatory.
Yeah.
He points to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, as the primary culprit destroying affordability.
And the mechanics of CEQA are vital to understand if we are analyzing Hilton's platform. So CEQA was signed into law in 1970 by Ronald Reagan.
Right.
The original intent was to force developers to disclose and mitigate the environmental impacts of massive projects, like, say, putting a highway through a wetland.
Which makes sense.
It does. Today, however, the mechanism of the law allows virtually anyone to file an anonymous lawsuit to halt development under the guise of environmental review.
I see this constantly in local city council meetings. A developer wants to build like a 5-story high-density apartment building right next to a transit hub.
Which is arguably the most environmentally friendly place to put housing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a local neighborhood group uses a CEQA lawsuit to claim the building will cast a shadow on a historic parking lot or, increase traffic.
Right.
The lawsuit ties the developer up in court for 5 years, the financing falls through, and the housing just never gets built.
And Hilton's platform is built on the premise that you cannot solve the housing crisis without fundamentally gutting that regulatory weapon. He argues that the private market has the capital and the desire to build millions of homes.
Yep.
But the state has made it mathematically impossible to turn a profit on middle-class housing. So his solution is sweeping deregulation and lowering taxes to unlock that private capital.
But, and I've got to push back on his outsider status here, based on the critiques in our sources.
Uh-huh.
Here is the flaw in that logic, and it's something a critical voter needs to ask. Let's say Hilton gets his way.
Okay.
He completely deregulates zoning and environmental review. A developer builds 10,000 new single-family homes in the Central Valley. Where does the water come from? Where is the electrical grid capacity coming from? We have rolling blackouts during heat waves and decades-long droughts. Deregulation doesn't just magically produce natural resources or public infrastructure. And critics argue his national conservative ties and lack of actual California governing experience mean his ideas might clash hard with the state's physical realities.
That is the structural counter-argument, precisely. Deregulation accelerates growth, but growth requires public infrastructure, which requires public funding.
Yeah.
And that funding is usually generated through taxes, which Hilton fundamentally wants to cut. So you hit a mathematical wall. The state still has to build water treatment plants, the roads, and the schools to support all that new housing.
Which transitions perfectly into candidate 3, Tom Steyer.
Yes.
Running as a progressive populist Democrat, he looks at the exact same housing and cost of living crisis as Hilton, but diagnoses the problem as a failure of capitalism, not a failure of regulation.
Completely opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Steyer's framework is that the private market will never build affordable housing because the profit margins are just too low. Therefore, the state must become the primary investor.
Right. Steyer's platform calls for massive state intervention. He is proposing the creation of 1 million affordable homes through public-private partnerships, heavily subsidized by the government.
1 million homes.
1 million. He also wants aggressive climate mandates, transitioning the state to a green energy economy much faster than the current timeline. And to fund all this, he is proposing significant wealth taxes on billionaires and a structural change to how corporations are taxed.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of that funding mechanism, specifically regarding Proposition 13, because Steyer is openly targeting the commercial property loopholes in Prop 13, and that is a massive third rail in California politics.
Oh, it's huge. To understand the magnitude of that proposal, we have to look at the fiscal balloon of Prop 13.
Walk us through it.
So passed in 1978, Prop 13 locked property tax assessments at the purchase price of the property, capping annual increases at 2%. The immediate benefit is obvious, right? A senior citizen who bought their home in 1980 for $80,000 isn't forced to sell because their home is now worth $1.5 million and they suddenly can't afford the property taxes.
Right. It protects homeowners.
Right.
But the balloon gets squeezed somewhere else.
Exactly.
Because local municipalities, school districts, county hospitals, they still need billions of dollars to operate. And because they are legally barred from raising residential property taxes to market rates, they have to squeeze revenue from other sources.
Right.
So the balloon bulges out in the form of the highest state income taxes in the nation, exorbitant sales taxes, and massive impact fees levied on new housing construction, which ironically makes building new housing incredibly expensive.
Spot on. Furthermore, Prop 13 applies to commercial real estate as well. You have massive corporate campuses or theme parks paying property taxes assessed on land values from the 1980s. Yeah. So Steyer's platform involves a split-roll approach. Keep the protections for residential homeowners, but reassess commercial properties to current market values. This would generate billions in new tax revenue to fund his social and environmental programs.
Okay, but let me push back on the reality of a split-roll tax from the perspective of an average consumer, just based on what the sources are saying.
Sure.
If Steyer succeeds in taxing commercial real estate at current market value, he's not just hitting giant tech campuses. He's hitting the real estate of grocery store chains and gas stations.
That's true.
A grocery store operates on a profit margin of roughly 1% to 2%. If their property tax bill suddenly triples, they don't just absorb that loss out of the goodness of their hearts. They pass that cost directly onto the consumer by raising the price of a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread.
Yes.
So how does aggressively taxing commercial property solve the cost of living crisis for a working-class family standing at the checkout counter?
Well, the macroeconomic data suggests exactly what you are describing. Corporate tax increases are routinely passed down to the consumer or the workforce. Steyer's economic advisors would counter that the generated revenue would be redistributed to that same working-class family in the form of universal health care, subsidized housing, and childcare, offsetting the increased cost of consumer goods.
Right.
It is fundamentally a philosophy of wealth redistribution.
But there's also the contradiction at the heart of his campaign that the opposition research highlights constantly.
The billionaire issue.
Yeah, Steyer is a billionaire. He made his fortune managing a hedge fund, heavily invested in the very fossil fuel and corporate structures he now campaigns against. He's basically self-funding a populist crusade against the elite using an elite fortune.
It's a tough needle to thread.
And additionally, the sources note an ongoing investigation into his campaign's use of undisclosed paid influencers on social media.
Yeah, that influencer investigation strikes at his core brand. When a candidate positions themselves as the transparent, moral alternative to a corrupt system, any opacity in their own operations is just magnified. Voters have a high tolerance for aggressive tactics, but a very low tolerance for hypocrisy.
Which brings us to candidate 4, someone whose entire brand is built on exposing that exact type of corporate hypocrisy. Katie Porter,
Yes, another Democrat.
former U.S. representative, operating heavily in the lane of the progressive reformer and watchdog.
Porter's cognitive framework is that the system isn't just broken, it is actively rigged by corporate monopolies. Her diagnosis of the cost of living crisis places the blame squarely on price gouging, corporate consolidation, and a lack of aggressive government oversight.
We all know the viral moments.
The whiteboard.
The whiteboard.
Hey.
The congressional committee hearings where she pulls out a whiteboard, breaks down the math of a pharmaceutical CEO's bonus structure, and just systematically dismantles their defense on live television.
Yeah, she's famous for it.
She is applying that same prosecutorial energy to her gubernatorial platform, promising to crack down on corporate housing speculation. Specifically, Wall Street firms buying up single-family homes and taking on the utility monopolies.
But the translation of that skill set from the legislative branch to the executive branch is where her platform faces its most rigorous test.
How so?
Well, being a congressional watchdog involves investigating, questioning, and exposing flaws in the system. Being the governor involves running a bureaucracy of hundreds of thousands of employees. You are no longer just questioning the failures of the DMV or the Employment Development Department. You are legally responsible for fixing them.
That's a huge shift. I noticed this looking at her strategy regarding utility monopolies like PG&E. The governor doesn't just get to yell at the CEO of PG&E on TV.
No.
The governor appoints the commissioners to the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, which literally sets the rates and regulates the safety of the grid. Porter's promise is to appoint consumer advocates rather than industry insiders. But managing an energy grid that doesn't cause wildfires while simultaneously transitioning to renewables that requires deep, technical administrative execution, not just strong oversight.
Exactly. And her polling numbers reflect some voter hesitation regarding that transition. While she has a fiercely loyal grassroots base, she has struggled to peel moderate suburban voters away from Becerra.
The unifying struggle.
Yeah. Furthermore, the persistent reports of staff management controversies and a high turnover rate in her congressional office offer a tangible critique. A toxic workplace in a congressional office of 20 people is a management issue. A toxic culture at the top of a state government managing a massive budget is a systemic liability.
Administrative execution is paramount. Let's pivot to the final candidate in our top 5, candidate 5, who offers a radically different type of administrative experience. Chad Bianco.
Running as a Republican.
Yes. He is the current sheriff of Riverside County, and he occupies the hardline, law and order conservative lane.
Bianco's framework views social order as the prerequisite for economic prosperity. His platform is built on the premise that businesses are fleeing the state and the cost of living is skyrocketing, primarily because of rampant property crime, unchecked homelessness, and a lack of basic physical security.
Now, when we talk about his administrative experience, running a county sheriff's department is actually significant.
Very.
A sheriff in California wields immense autonomous power. They run the county jails, they patrol massive unincorporated areas, and they are independently elected, meaning they don't answer to a mayor or a city council. Bianco is used to having the ultimate executive authority within his domain.
But translating the localized authority of a sheriff to the negotiated power of a governor is a massive leap. A governor must negotiate with a legislature that may be deeply hostile to their agenda.
Right.
And Bianco's platform is the most aggressive in the field. He wants to repeal California's sanctuary state laws, heavily restrict environmental regulations that he argues kill business, and vastly expand law enforcement funding and powers.
That sanctuary state repeal is a massive flashpoint in the primary guides. The mechanism of Senate Bill 54, the sanctuary law, essentially prohibits local and state police from using their resources to investigate or arrest people for federal immigration enforcement purposes, or from transferring individuals to ICE without a judicial warrant.
Right.
Bianca wants to completely dismantle that barrier, arguing that it harbors criminals.
But the political reality of attempting to repeal that in a state with a massive immigrant population and a deeply entrenched progressive legislature is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
His opponents also point to significant controversies within his own department. There is his documented past association with the Oath Keepers, an anti-government militia group.
Which is a huge talking point for his critics.
Absolutely. And there are also severe criticisms regarding the conditions and in-custody death rates at the Riverside County jails under his command.
So the question for a voter analyzing Bianco is whether a platform that resonates intensely in the more rural, conservative inland counties, like the Inland Empire or the Central Valley, can realistically build a winning coalition across the heavily populated, deeply democratic coastal cities like LA and San Francisco.
It's a tough demographic math problem. So we have outlined 5 distinct frameworks: Becerra's institutional management, Hilton's market deregulation, Steyer's state-funded intervention, Porter's anti-monopoly oversight, and Bianco's rigid enforcement.
Right.
And the true test of these frameworks is applying them to the most visible, visceral crisis in the state: homelessness.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you can't view homelessness, housing, and the cost of living as separate issues. They are totally connected.
They are essentially the same crisis viewed from different angles.
Yeah. And this is where the philosophical divide among the candidates becomes a tangible reality on the street. The policies dictating how we handle individuals sleeping on the sidewalk represent a fundamental clash over the definition of compassion and the role of the state. I sort of map this out as a divide between enforcement first and investment first.
That's a good way to frame it. Let's examine the mechanics of the enforcement-first approach championed by Bianco and Hilton. Their philosophy is that public spaces, parks, sidewalks, transit stations must be preserved for public use.
Right.
They advocate for the strict enforcement of anti-camping ordinances and the aggressive clearing of encampments.
But Bianca takes a step further regarding the underlying causes, right? He strongly advocates for expanding mandatory treatment for severe mental illness and addiction.
Yes.
The intellectual argument from his camp is that leaving an individual suffering from drug-induced psychosis on the street, vulnerable to the elements and exploitation under the guise of respecting their civil liberties, is actually the ultimate form of cruelty.
And the counter-argument to that, heavily emphasized by civil liberties organizations and progressive advocates, is that you cannot enforce your way out of a housing deficit.
Right.
If you clear an encampment, but the county shelter is at 100% capacity and the wait list for subsidized housing is 5 years long, the individuals simply move to the next block. It is an administrative shell game.
Which leads us directly to the investment-first philosophy of Steyer and Porter. Their framework defines compassion as providing unconditional safety nets.
Yes.
They heavily favor the housing-first model, which posits that you cannot effectively treat an individual's addiction or mental illness until you have provided them with the stability of a locked door and a roof over their head.
But the logistical hurdle for the housing-first approach in California is the astronomical cost of construction. The state frequently spends upwards of $800,000 to build a single unit of affordable housing.
I have to pause on that number because it sounds completely absurd to an average listener. I mean, how does a 500-square-foot studio apartment cost $800,000 to build?
It's wild, but the cost isn't just lumber and concrete. It is the cumulative effect of the regulations we discussed earlier. It is the cost of buying land in expensive coastal areas. It is the cost of prevailing wage laws, which mandate union-level pay for construction workers on public projects.
Okay.
It is the cost of specialized environmental materials required by state climate mandates. It is the years of legal fees fighting CEQA lawsuits filed by local residents who just don't want a homeless shelter in their zip code. The bureaucratic friction consumes the budget before a shovel ever hits the dirt.
Wait, so where does Becerra fit into this?
Becerra attempts to thread the needle.
The middle ground.
Yeah, the middle ground. He focuses on eviction prevention and mental health support, while also trying to cut red tape for faster housing approvals without gutting the regulations entirely.
Which is exactly what we mean when we talk about spotting a realistic solution versus a campaign slogan.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? How do we verify these claims?
Well, what's fascinating here is the interconnected domino effect. California's problems are uniquely intertwined. Housing shortages drive homelessness. Climate policies impact energy prices. Immigration affects labor markets. You have to ask, when a candidate says they will end homelessness or slash taxes, do they explain how that impacts the connected dominoes?
Like when Steyer says, I will build 1 million affordable homes, A voter needs to look at the math. If it costs the state $800,000 per unit under current regulations, a million homes cost $800 billion.
Yeah.
The entire annual state budget is roughly $300 billion. So unless he explains the exact legislative mechanism he will use to either gut the regulations that cause the friction, which would anger his environmental base, or find $500 billion in new tax revenue, the promise is mathematically impossible.
That analytical rigor is the most powerful tool a voter has. You must evaluate the proposed implementation, not just the intent. A governor has to run a massive bureaucracy.
Right.
When Becerra says he will streamline these processes, you have to ask what specific executive orders he will actually sign. When Porter says she will crack down on corporate landlords, you have to ask if the state has the legal authority to dictate private real estate transactions without triggering a mass exodus of capital.
And when you look at executive experience versus outsider appeal, it's stark. Becerra has vast experience running HHS. Porter knows congressional oversight deeply, but lacks executive management. Bianco runs a county sheriff's department.
While Hilton and Steyer have virtually zero elected executive government experience.
Right, operating instead as a media figure and a private investor.
A realistic solution requires knowing how to actually pass legislation through the California state legislature. A slogan sounds great on a billboard, but a solution has a funding mechanism and a legislative pathway.
This level of intertwined complexity is exactly why the concept of the local stability voter has become so prominent in the polling data we're looking at.
Yes, the stability voter.
We aren't just talking about political junkies here. We are talking about millions of Californians who are fundamentally exhausted by the perpetual sense of crisis.
Stability is a remarkably powerful political motivator. It is the desire for predictability. A stability voter prioritizes a functioning status quo over ideological victories.
Yeah.
They want to know that the power grid won't fail in August, that their commute won't be disrupted by a cleared encampment moving onto the freeway on-ramp, and that their tax bill won't suddenly double to fund a grand social experiment.
If we frame the election through the lens of continuity versus disruption, Becerra is really the definitive anchor. He's the only candidate offering a tune-up rather than a teardown.
Yes.
His deep government experience appeals directly to voters who believe California just needs competent tweaking, not a demolition. The other four candidates, despite being on opposite ends of the political spectrum, are all agents of massive disruption.
Exactly. Hilton and Bianco represent conservative disruption, rolling back environmental regulations, overturning sanctuary state policies, fundamentally shrinking state government.
Right.
Steyer and Porter represent progressive disruption.
Huh.
Aggressive green energy transitions, massive wealth redistribution, and aggressively dismantling corporate utility monopolies.
So if your absolute top priority is local stability, avoiding unpredictable ripple effects across your daily life, schools, or businesses, the disruptors carry inherent risk.
But the flip side of that is the argument that the status quo is fundamentally unsustainable.
Right.
If you believe the state is already failing, if your rent is 60% of your income or your small business is suffocating under permit fees, then stability looks exactly like the problem and disruption looks like the only viable cure.
And for a lot of voters, stability means safety. Crime and stability go hand in hand.
Definitely.
Bianco offers the most hardline law and order approach. Hilton criticizes lenient democratic policies. Steyer and Porter focus on root causes and police accountability. While Becerra tries to balance reform with funding police, the voter must decide which mechanism actually translates to a safer daily experience in their specific community.
And that brings us to the application phase. How does the listener synthesize all this?
Let's do exactly that. Let's take all of these mechanisms, all of these interconnected crises, and map them directly onto your own cognitive frameworks.
The values alignment quiz.
Yes, the interactive quiz from our source material. I invite you, the listener, to mentally play along right now. We'll walk through the 10 questions and explicitly map your core values to the candidates. So A is Becerra, B is Hilton, C is Steyer, D is Porter, and E is Bianco.
I love this part. Let's volley these. I'll take the first theme. Questions 1 and 9 focus on the big picture.
Okay.
What is your biggest concern? Is it maintaining stability and competence? That's A. High taxes and government inefficiency? That's B.
Or is it climate change and wealth inequality? That's C. Corporate corruption, monopolies. D. Or is your primary concern crime and border security? That would be E.
Next theme, the street level. Questions 2 and 4. How do you handle homelessness and crime? Do you prefer mental health investments balanced with traditional policing? A.
Or building emergency shelters and enforcing strict camping penalties? That's B.
How about a housing first approach focusing on root economic causes? C. Or maybe focusing on systemic accountability and police oversight?
D.
Or do you favor aggressive clearing of encampments and unrestricted law enforcement? That's E.
Questions 3 and 5 tackle the wallet. What is your economic and tax philosophy? A progressive but efficiently managed tax system.
A. Free market approach with aggressively lower taxes and deregulation. B.
Instituting new wealth taxes to fund massive government investments.
C. Raising corporate taxes while focusing heavily on consumer protection. D.
Or a strict small government approach with deep spending cuts to protect Prop 13.
E. Okay, questions 6 and 8 look at state identity, specifically immigration and climate. Do you want to protect immigrants while making balanced, moderate climate adjustments? A.
Secure the borders and avoid any climate rules that hurt businesses. B.
Keep the sanctuary state and make climate action the central priority of the government. C.
Provide legal support for immigrants and force corporate climate accountability.
D.
Or increase ICE cooperation and ensure environmental rules don't hamper policing and growth. That's E.
Finally, questions 7 and 10 on leadership style. Do you want an experienced, moderate insider? A.
A system-challenging, business-minded outsider. B.
A visionary, well-funded activist. C.
A tough, policy-focused watchdog.
D. Or a direct action, law and order authority figure. That's E.
So tally those up in your head. If you chose mostly A, you are looking for pragmatic stability. Your match is Xavier Becerra.
If you chose mostly B, your priority is lower taxes and deregulation. Your match is Steve Hilton.
If you lean C, you want aggressive climate action and systemic change funded by the wealthy. Your match is Tom Steyer.
Mostly D means your focus is on transparency, anti-corruption, and consumer protection. Katie Porter is your candidate.
And if you overwhelmingly chose E, you're prioritizing strict law enforcement and traditional conservative values. Chad Bianco is your match.
It really clarifies the field when you break it down by values rather than just political ads.
It really does. But we have to reiterate the importance of doing your homework. Read the platforms, watch the debates, and seriously follow the money. A quiz is a starting point, not a final decision.
This raises an important question, though, as we wrap up. There are no simple solutions because the state's problems are deeply, deeply connected. The true test of the best candidate is finding the one whose proposed implementation realistically matches the state's complex machinery.
Exactly. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Consider that when you cast your vote for California's governor, you aren't just choosing a local administrator to fix the potholes. Because of California's massive economic and cultural gravity, you are effectively voting on the prototype for America's future policies a decade from now.
It's true, the model home.
Yeah. The policies debated in Sacramento today, whether it's banning gas cars or testing basic income or taxing wealth, they invariably migrate eastward. So which candidate's vision do you want the rest of the country to eventually inherit?
It's a huge responsibility.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 2026 gubernatorial race. The tools are in your hands. Do your research, verify the claims, and most importantly, get out there and vote.